Imagine just for a second, two film students just out of the University of Central Florida, armed with a $60,000 budget, a 35-page script with 3 unknown actors improvising most of it, and then going on to shoot 20 hours of footage whilst walking around some woods. Doesn't exactly sound like a one-step strut to instant Hollywood success, right? Well, that's exactly where you're wrong, because that film ended up making a staggering $248.6 million at the box office worldwide, and single-handedly revived the found footage genre to the forefront of mainstream horror. The Blair Witch Project is one of the few low-budget cinematic phenomenons that has taken the world by storm. Its presence led to several successful found footage franchises, and the lore of the Blair Witch still thrives on today, 20 years later, both with a 2016 remake and 2019 video game. With a successful lifespan like that, you'd imagine that the mavericks behind the project might too be thriving in Hollywood, perhaps with a string of other successful horrors in the bank, or maybe a Fast and Furious film, similarly to what we've seen from the creators of Saw. Well, again, that might be where you're wrong. In fact, Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick weren't ever really given that chance. But why? What led them from being two of the most innovative, cash-profiting young directors in Hollywood to simply disappearing along with the characters they had created in 1999? I'm Tom from Screen on Point, and this is how the Blair Witch cursed its directors. Long before its debut at the Sundance Film Festival, the Blair Witch Project, and specifically its mythology, had already been built for years before the film even went into production, and the depth in which Sanchez and Myrick had gone to develop a realistic found footage film started off with the very investors of the film itself, pitching an 8-minute documentary to financiers that included fake newspaper articles and fake news footage. Sanchez and Myrick elaborated that with a budget, they could promise the very set of videotapes that depicted the disappearance of the students on their documentary. Shocked at what they had learned, the investors propelled the film into pre-production, and casting was on its way. Playing a fictionalized version of themselves, Heather Donahue, Michael C. Williams, and Joshua Leonard, equipped with both a film and digital camera, were subjected to 8 days worth of method filmmaking, where the filmmakers moved them from checkpoint to checkpoint with fewer narrative points, camera batteries, and food as they went on. This method is reflected on screen as the film progresses. The handy-cam POV shots descend from the combined steady but stylistically different perspective of the film and digital cameras into a ball of inseparable chaotic mess. Therefore, the viewer's experience and emotional state deteriorates along with the characters on screen. Instead of portraying this deterioration on screen as well as seen with one of the most notorious found footage films in history, Cannibal Holocaust, Sanchez and Myrick's narrative doesn't let the viewer breathe. It's an interactive experience that subjects the viewer to a 74-minute point of view event that leads you facing down in the dirt. For the news to spread, the audience members were experiencing motion sickness, and some being physically ill in theatres upon the film's release helped add to that ever-growing mythology. Brought up by Artisan Entertainment after originally marketed at Sundance with flyers that asked for viewers to come forward with any information they had on the missing characters, and then spearheaded by their online presence, the mythology of the Blair Witch Project blossomed into one of the first films to fuel itself on successful viral digital marketing, despite having few technologies to aid it. Through word of mouth, the lore of the Blair Witch Project, the method filmmaking that led the actors into an immersive state of exhaustion, and the underutilized forgotten genre culminated into a sleeper Hollywood hit that allowed both Sanchez and Myrick the opportunity to explore other ideas, this time backed with a multi-million-dollar budget, or at least that's what they thought. While both Sanchez and Myrick pocketed a neat million each for directing The Blair Witch, their production company Haxan Films, along with producers Greg Hale, Michael Monello, and Robin Cowie, and investors earned an estimated $30 to $40 million, giving the small 5-man production team the ability to choose what they were going to produce next. While Artisan were keen to press for an immediate sequel off the back of the first success, Sanchez and Myrick were keen to take an alternative route with what Sanchez described as a Monty Python meets airplane comedy that will be the most politically incorrect movie imaginable. It will also probably make enemies out of all those who are now gushing about Blair. oh well, what can you do? Therefore, Artisan went ahead with their own sequel with a new director, Joe Berlinger, whose vision erased the very elements that made the first so successful. Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2 was made up of a makeshift narrative, cheesy acting, and an uninspired shot list that left it feeling very alien to what fans had loved so much about the original. The consequences of this led the film to make a fraction of what the original earned at the box office, and by the late 2000s, Artisan itself was in tremendous financial debt. For Haxan Films, Sanchez and Myrick, the generous financial stability that suddenly entered their lives from the success of The Blair Witch caused an inexperienced overextension as they set up an office and hired staff in preparation to tackle the offers of producing An Exorcist 4 and Freddy vs. Jason. However, as inexperienced business people and merely independent filmmakers, the company was unable to close any major deals, and by 2001, Artisan had opted out of the duo's Python-inspired Heart of Love, leaving the entire film cancelled in 2002, and by 2004 Haxan themselves had to close their offices. Left with Heart of Love in developmental hell, filmless 7 years after the release of The Blair Witch, and unable to break into another genre, both Sanchez and Myrick went their separate ways to create their own standalone films. For Sanchez, he was back in the horror directing seat with a low-budget version of an alien abduction film called Altered, and while the film was praised for its substantially better special effects in comparison to other B horror straight-to-DVD flicks, it wasn't able to pull the trigger on being anything more than average. Sanchez, however, proved that he could work effectively with a Hollywood budget, in contrast to the free-for-all improvisation that he established in the filming The Blair Witch. Here, he presented a film with thoughtful direction and elevated pieces of set horror, not only above the line of easy shock horror gore, but enabled the narrative to progress more naturally despite the content of the story. From slow one-shot tracking movements to quickly cut close-ups of reactive horror and back again, or meaningful driven close-ups to enhance the relationships of his characters, pace, and Sanchez's pace was competently delivered. While Myrick worked on 2 ultra-low budget films in the interim, The Strand and Believers, Sanchez started working on his next feature film, Seventh Moon, with a casting of Amy Smart, famed for her popularity in the early 2000s, in the main role. It seemed like Sanchez, as well as Haxan Films, were working their way back up the industry ladder, or so it seemed. Whether Sanchez knew it or not, with Seventh Moon, despite a promising premise, the film ended up being a copy of the Blair Witch Project, but without the tools that made it such a hit. Set in China during the Hungry Ghost Festival, honeymooners Melissa and Yule discovered that at night, the legend of the Hungry Ghost comes alive. Where the Blair Witch had excelled with original fictional folklore, Seventh Moon relies on almost no world building despite the myths and folklore surrounding the Hungry Ghost, which the film is based on, being deep in avenues of creative possibilities. Unlike The Blair Witch, which portrays the folklore in various dialogue sequences with townspeople and then elaborated by Heather herself in the documentary footage, Seventh Moon sets up the audience to know as little as the characters do, and therefore interjects Urbanoid as its main theme, city folk travelling to a rural location and experiencing the horrors of its local people. This is a theme that had been tried and tried again throughout film history to this point, and in Seventh Moon this Urbanoid is rationalised by the central characters simply because they're in China, which is reinforced in the dialogue itself.
We're in China, Yul.
Yeah, I know we're in China, Mel, but this isn't just China weird, okay? It's fucking just weird.
And essentially every Chinese character in Seventh Moon is an antagonist, from Ping, the tour guide leading them astray, a man that they rescue who ultimately betrays them, to off-screen characters yelling and inviting the ghost to dismantle them. This could be excused if the viewer had any emotional connection to the main characters, but the film's narrative and direction does very little to make you empathise with the characters from the moment they are introduced as loud drunkards at a cultural festival. Generally, it just comes off pretty culturally insensitive. Like The Blair Witch, Seventh Moon also adopts a voyeuristic, shaky handycam style of shooting for the entirety of the film, but unlike The Blair Witch, the style doesn't cater to or help the story. Aside from presenting the main characters as outsiders that are always being watched, and in turn setting the viewer in the perspective of those onlookers, the POV shots ultimately offset the effectiveness of the moments of POV from either the ghosts or the characters, as the horror they are trying to invoke in those those moments are lost amongst the others. For all the good that Altered created, Seventh Moon was a major step back for Sanchez, from originality, direction to even the creature designs. The film concluded to be a critical and commercial flop, and Sanchez would never fully recover, having guest directed television shows throughout the 2010s and also working on some super low budget films, clearly unable to muster up any confidence in major Hollywood financing. Daniel Myrick's opportunity to rekindle some of his Blair Witch success also came in the same year of Seventh Moon in 2008 with Solstice, a film that he had also written that focused on the paranormal with a handful of future stars in Amanda Seyfried and Shawn Ashmore, as well as a couple of actors from the successful teen show One Tree Hill. Like Seventh Moon, Solstice, a remake of the Danish film Midsummer, leaned heavily in traditional cabin in the woods tropes, as a bunch of city teenagers travel to the countryside and encounter narrative setups that are now inseparable to countless other B horror films. The lack of originality from an innovator who brained the Blair Witch had instantly stacked the cards against himself, and while the film was technically and thoughtfully directed, it only made $2.5 million worldwide with a budget much bigger than that, and now Myrick too was unable to recover. To compare Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick to James Wan and Leigh Whannell, the creators of Saw, who have gone on to have a handful of successful films, despite the two wanting to test themselves with other projects, Wan and Whannell knew the importance of what they had created. They knew with a low budget success that a studio would want more, and their nurturing on offsetting the sequels into the hands of other brilliant creators enabled them to have continued success. And unfortunately for Sanchez and Myrick, their uninterest in the very phenomenon they created, with the release of an unsuccessful second Blair Witch film and an abandoned third, meant they majorly handicapped themselves in a machine that they were unaware of how to maneuver. With any great storytellers, the key is always to be 2 steps ahead. And above all, you can never underestimate the curse of the Blair Witch. Thanks for watching that video. Please do like and subscribe, and do let us know your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to follow us at Screen On Point and Tom A. Ransom on Twitter to satisfy my narcissistic need for acceptance and love, and you make sure you have a wonderful day.